Your soul doesn't go where you think. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, described what happens in the first moments after death with disturbing precision. For decades, neurologists dismissed his accounts as mysticism. Then researchers started monitoring brain activity in patients at the threshold of death, and the data began matching patterns Cayce described in 1923. Scientists are now seeing electrical surges in dying brains that align with his claims about consciousness separating from the body. The timing, the sequence, the sensations, they're appearing in peer-reviewed studies, and no one can explain why a man with an 8th grade education predicted them. If you want to know what comes next, subscribe now because this gets stranger. Cayce gave over 14,000 readings while in trance states, but his descriptions of the afterlife weren't philosophical, they were technical. He spoke of the soul encountering what he called the silver cord, a luminous tether connecting consciousness to the physical form. Modern neuroscience has documented a phenomenon during clinical death, a burst of gamma-wave activity stronger than waking consciousness, occurring in the seconds after the heart stops. Researchers at the University of Michigan recorded this surge in 2023, and it corresponds precisely to the moment Cayce said the cord begins to loosen. The brainwave signature doesn't fade, it intensifies. Consciousness doesn't dim, it sharpens. But here's the first contradiction. Cayce insisted that what you experience immediately after death is not universal. It's not a tunnel, it's not a light. It depends entirely on what you believed while alive. He described the afterlife as a realm where thought becomes environment, where your expectations shape the landscape you enter. If you believed in nothing, you encounter nothing, a gray expanse, a silence so complete it becomes unbearable. If you believed in punishment, you generate it. Your own mind becomes the architect of what happens next. Neurologists studying near-death experiences have found that cultural background drastically alters the imagery people report. Christians see Christ, Hindus see deities, atheists report voids. The content differs, but the neurological pattern, the gamma surge, the sense of leaving the body, is identical. Cayce said this in 1931. Science confirmed it 90 years later. Then there's the pause. Cayce called it the Hall of Records, a moment where the soul reviews its entire life, not as memory, but as direct experience. You don't watch your life, you relive it, feeling every emotion you caused in others. Researchers studying life reviews in resuscitated patients have documented something unexpected. The recall is not chronological, it's instantaneous. Every moment of a person's existence becomes accessible at once, as though time collapses. Neuroscientists hypothesize this could be the brain's final act, dumping all stored memories in a last cascade of neural firing. But the patients describe it differently. They say they didn't just remember, they understood. They felt the pain they caused, the joy they gave, as though inhabiting the people they'd touched. Cayce described this exact phenomenon in a reading given in 1936, stating that the soul becomes all it has ever been to others. The mechanism he proposed, empathy as a dimensional shift, has no equivalent in neurology, yet the reports match. And then the contradiction deepens. Cayce said that after the life review, the soul doesn't move toward light, it moves toward vibration. He described planes of existence calibrated to specific frequencies, and he insisted that the soul migrates not based on moral judgment, but on resonance. You don't go where you deserve, you go where you match. He described souls trapped in what he called the borderland, a space between physical death and full transition, occupied by those so attached to earthly concerns, money, grudges, unfinished arguments, that they couldn't attune to higher frequencies. They lingered, perceiving the living world but unable to interact with it. Modern parapsychology has documented thousands of cases describing this exact state. Apparitions tied to specific locations, EVP recordings that suggest awareness without agency, electromagnetic anomalies in places where sudden deaths occurred. Skeptics dismiss it. But the consistency across cultures and centuries is harder to explain. Cayce didn't call them ghosts, he called them earthbound entities, souls stuck because their frequency wouldn't shift. Here's where it turns. Cayce claimed that the afterlife is not static, it's educational. He described planes of existence where souls learn, where consciousness evolves by confronting the consequences of past actions, not as punishment, but as curriculum. He said the soul doesn't rest, it works, and the work is specific, understanding what you failed to understand in life. He described realms where souls obsessed with power are placed in scenarios where they have none, where they experience powerlessness until they grasp its weight. He described realms where souls who lived in isolation are forced into collective existence, where they cannot escape the presence of others until they learn connection. Researchers studying hypnotic regression, Michael Newton, Brian Weiss, have recorded patient testimonies describing these exact environments. The details vary, but the structure is identical. Corrective experience, not punishment. Cayce called it the school of the soul. Regression therapists call it interlife. The terminology differs, the architecture doesn't. But then the deeper contradiction. Cayce insisted that not all souls move forward, some move backward. He described a phenomenon he called devolution, where a soul, through repeated refusal to grow, loses complexity. It doesn't cease to exist, it simplifies. He said a human soul could, over multiple cycles of regression, lose self-awareness and re-enter lower forms of consciousness. He wasn't talking about reincarnation as evolution. He was talking about reincarnation as potential decay. Buddhists have a concept for this, the hungry ghost realms, states of existence characterized by insatiable craving and diminished awareness. Cayce described it in mechanical terms, frequency drop. A soul that clings to base impulses, rage, addiction, greed, vibrates at a lower rate, and if it continues to lower, it falls out of human incarnation entirely. He gave a reading in 1934 where he described a soul that had lost its way so completely that it could no longer sustain human form. It would, he said, return as something simpler, something without choice. No modern framework accounts for this. Theology offers damnation or salvation. Cayce offered regression as a natural consequence of refusal. And he said it was reversible, but only through immense effort over multiple lifetimes. Magnetic field studies have added a strange dimension to this. Researchers measuring the Earth's magnetic field have noted fluctuations that correlate with heightened reports of near-death experiences and paranormal phenomena. The field isn't stable. It shifts, weakens in certain regions, strengthens in others. Cayce spoke of this in his readings, claiming that the veil between the physical and spiritual planes was not uniform. He said certain locations on Earth, places of intense geological activity, places where the magnetic field was thin, allowed easier passage. He described these as portals, areas where souls could more easily perceive or interact with the living. Modern surveys of haunted locations show a striking correlation: high EMF readings, geological fault lines, underground water sources. The environmental conditions Cayce described as conducive to spiritual activity match the conditions skeptics dismiss as electromagnetic interference. The question is whether the interference is causing hallucinations or whether it's allowing genuine perception. Then there's the guide. Cayce said no soul transitions alone. He described the presence of what he called companions, entities that meet the newly deceased and orient them to the new environment. He insisted these were not angels in a religious sense, but evolved souls who had chosen to assist others in crossing. He described them as patient, silent, and adaptive. They appear in forms the dying mind can accept. If you expect a deceased relative, they assume that appearance. If you expect nothing, they wait until you're ready. Near-death researchers have cataloged thousands of accounts describing exactly this: a figure, often familiar, often silent, guiding the individual through initial disorientation. Carl Jung described encountering such a presence during his own near-death experience in 1944, calling it a being of immense authority. Cayce had described the phenomenon 30 years earlier. He said the guide's role was not to direct, but to stabilize, to prevent the soul from fragmenting in the initial shock of separation. He claimed that without this presence, some souls shatter, losing coherence entirely, becoming what he called dispersed consciousness. Modern psychology has no term for this, but dissociative identity disorder, consciousness fragmenting under trauma, suggests the mind is capable of such breakage. Cayce claimed it could happen to the soul. Here's the next twist. Cayce said that time, as experienced after death, is not linear. He described the afterlife as a state where past, present, and future exist simultaneously, where the soul perceives all potential outcomes of its choices at once. He called it the eternal now, a condition where the soul is no longer bound by sequential time. Physicists studying quantum mechanics have proposed similar structures: block time, where all moments exist concurrently, and consciousness simply moves through them. Cayce described this in a reading from 1938, stating that the soul, once freed from the body, sees all that was, is, and may be. He claimed this was overwhelming for newly transitioned souls, that they required time, though time no longer existed in the way they understood, to adjust to perceiving existence as a whole rather than a sequence. Patients revived from clinical death sometimes describe this, the sense that everything was happening at once, that they could see their entire life and all possible futures simultaneously. Neurologists attribute it to the brain misfiring. Cayce attributed it to the soul perceiving reality as it actually is. But contradiction again. Cayce insisted that not all souls perceive this expanded state. Some remain locked in loops, replaying single moments or single traumas indefinitely. He described souls trapped in the instant of their death, unable to move beyond it, reliving the final seconds over and over. He said this happened to those who died in extreme fear, rage, or denial, emotions so intense they anchored the soul to that moment. Paranormal investigators have documented phenomena consistent with this: residual hauntings, where the same actions repeat without awareness, as though recorded on the environment itself. Cayce said these weren't conscious entities, they were fragments, echoes of consciousness that had failed to fully transition. He claimed they could be freed, but only through external intervention: prayer, focused intention, ritualistic release. Modern ghost hunters use similar methods, often without understanding why they work. Cayce said they work because consciousness is susceptible to resonance. A focused mind can disrupt a loop. A prayer can shift a frequency. Satellite data has introduced another unsettling angle. Measurements of the magnetosphere show periodic distortions, windows where the field weakens, allowing increased solar radiation to penetrate. These windows correlate with historical spikes in mystical experiences, mass visions, and reports of the dead appearing to the living. Cayce referenced this indirectly, stating that the veil thins at certain times, that communication between planes becomes easier. He described specific planetary alignments that facilitated this, claiming that the positions of celestial bodies affected the permeability of the barrier between worlds. Astrologers have long claimed this. Cayce treated it as physics. And when researchers map historical events described as mass spiritual phenomena, Fatima, the Angel of Mons, widespread ghost sightings during wartime, they find geomagnetic disturbances recorded in the same periods. The correlation doesn't prove causation, but it suggests that whatever separates the living from the dead is not as stable as we assume. Cayce also spoke of entities that were never human. He described intelligences existing in the afterlife realms that had never incarnated in physical form, beings he called the Watchers. He claimed they observed, recorded, and occasionally intervened in human development, though their motives were incomprehensible to human awareness. He described them as ancient, non-corporeal, and utterly indifferent to human moral frameworks. He said they operated on scales of time that rendered individual human lives invisible, that they perceived humanity as a process, not as individuals. This aligns disturbingly with reports from deep meditation practitioners and near-death experiencers who describe encountering presences that are aware but utterly alien, conscious but not in any way that resembles human thought. Cayce warned against attempting contact with these entities. He said they existed in frequencies far removed from human vibration, and trying to reach them often resulted in psychological fracture. He described individuals who had, through intense occult practice, forced such contact, and returned broken, incapable of reintegrating into normal consciousness. Modern psychiatry would call this psychosis. Cayce called it dimensional trauma, exposure to realities the human mind wasn't designed to process. Then the reincarnation mechanism. Cayce didn't describe reincarnation as automatic. He described it as choice, but choice constrained by karma, by unresolved patterns, by frequencies that hadn't been corrected. He said souls choose their next incarnation based on what they need to learn, selecting circumstances that will force confrontation with previous failures. He described councils, gatherings of evolved souls who advise but do not command, helping the transitioning soul identify the optimal conditions for growth. He said some souls choose extremely difficult lives, poverty, illness, violence, not as punishment but as accelerated learning. He claimed that suffering, when chosen, compresses growth. A single lifetime of hardship could accomplish what 10 comfortable lifetimes could not. Regression therapists working with patients under hypnosis have documented detailed pre-birth memories describing exactly this: the soul reviewing potential lives, weighing options, selecting challenges. Skeptics call it confabulation, but the consistency across unrelated patients, across cultures, across decades of research is harder to dismiss. Cayce described the process in 1933. Therapists started recording matching accounts in the 1980s. Here's where it fractures further. Cayce said not all souls reincarnate on Earth. He described other planets, other dimensions, where souls could incarnate to learn different lessons. He spoke of Venus, Mars, Jupiter, not as physical locations but as vibrational states, realms of existence where consciousness operated under different laws. He said a soul might spend lifetimes on Earth, then move to what he called the Uranian plane to learn detachment, or the Venusian plane to learn love in its purest form. He described these planes as real, populated, structured, not metaphors but actual environments where consciousness evolved. Astronomers would call this absurd, but Cayce's framework aligns oddly with multiverse theory, with the idea that consciousness might exist across parallel dimensions, that identity might not be confined to a single timeline. He said the soul's journey was vast, that Earth was one classroom among thousands, and he said some souls never return to Earth, they graduate. Deep ocean research has found something unexpected. Hydrothermal vents, miles below the surface, emit sounds, low-frequency pulses that marine biologists cannot explain. The patterns are rhythmic, almost linguistic, and they occur in regions where magnetic anomalies are strongest. Cayce spoke of oceans as memory fields, places where the Earth stores psychic impressions. He claimed that water retained consciousness, that traumatic events near large bodies of water left imprints that could be sensed by sensitive individuals. Sonar mapping of shipwreck sites has revealed acoustic anomalies, sounds that don't match known marine life, that seem to echo human voices, human patterns. Skeptics attribute it to equipment malfunction, but the consistency, the repetition, the fact that certain wrecks produce the same anomalies across different ships, different equipment, different decades, it suggests something else. Cayce said the dead linger where they died violently. Oceanographers are recording sounds they can't classify in those exact locations. Cayce also described what happens to souls who reject the transition entirely. He said some souls, upon realizing they are dead, refuse to believe it. They deny the evidence, cling to their former identity, and attempt to remain in the physical world. He described them as the most dangerous entities because they seek to inhabit the living, not maliciously, but desperately. He called it obsession, the attempt of a disembodied soul to experience physicality through another's body. He described symptoms, sudden personality changes, compulsions that feel external, intrusive thoughts that don't align with the person's character. Modern psychology calls this dissociation, intrusive ideation, perhaps schizophrenia. Cayce called it invasion. He said it was more common than people realized, that many psychological disorders were actually cases of partial possession, where a fragment of a deceased consciousness had latched onto a living mind. He described methods for clearing this: specific prayers, visualizations, energy work. Exorcism is the religious term. Cayce treated it as frequency adjustment, raising the living person's vibration until the intruding entity could no longer sustain the connection. And then the final contradiction, the one that collapses everything. Cayce said that death, as we understand it, doesn't exist. He insisted that what we call death is simply a shift in vibration, a change in the frequency of consciousness. The body dies, consciousness does not. It transitions to a state where it perceives reality from a different angle, but it never ceases. He said the fear of death was humanity's greatest illusion, that the soul was indestructible, that every experience, every lifetime, every moment of awareness was Yungu. He described reincarnation not as rebirth but as continuity, the soul moving through forms, through planes, through lessons, but never starting over. You are not a new person in each life. You are the same consciousness, wearing different masks. And every life, every death, every transition is remembered, not consciously but cellularly, energetically, stored in the soul's structure. He said this was why children sometimes recall past lives, why certain people feel inexplicable grief for places they've never been. The soul remembers, the mind forgets, but trauma, love, fear, they persist. They shape the next incarnation. They determine the next lesson. Glacial core samples have revealed something strange. Ice layers dating back thousands of years contain microscopic air bubbles, and when analyzed, some bubbles contain oxygen isotopes that shouldn't exist in Earth's atmosphere. The ratios are wrong. The composition suggests contamination from an external source, something entering the atmosphere that wasn't produced here. Cayce spoke of Earth being visited by non-physical intelligences, entities from other planes that occasionally intersected with ours. He said these visitations left traces, that sensitive equipment would eventually detect them. He gave this reading in 1932. The isotope anomalies were discovered in Antarctic ice cores in 2019. The official explanation is meteorite dust. But the distribution doesn't match impact patterns. It matches something diffusing through the atmosphere over centuries. Cayce described one final stage. He called it the dissolving. He said that after countless incarnations, after the soul had learned all it needed to learn, it reached a point where individuality was no longer necessary. The soul merged back into what he called the source, losing its distinct identity, but retaining all its accumulated experience. He said this was not annihilation, it was completion. The soul didn't cease to exist. It expanded to encompass all existence. It became part of the unified field of consciousness that generated all reality. He described souls who had reached this stage as the masters, beings who could still manifest in lower planes to teach, but no longer needed to incarnate. He said they existed in a state of perpetual awareness, perceiving all lifetimes, all choices, all outcomes simultaneously. He called it oneness, the final destination of every soul. But he warned it could take millennia. He said most souls were still in the early stages, still learning basic lessons, compassion, humility, love. He said Earth was a beginner's plane. The soul's journey extended far beyond it. And here's the haunting part. Cayce said you could remember all of this right now, while alive. He claimed that deep meditation, focused intention, and specific breathing techniques could allow a living person to access the soul's full memory, every past life, every transition, every moment in the afterlife realms. He described individuals who had done this, who had seen their entire soul history and returned to physical life with absolute certainty of what comes next. He said this knowledge changed them completely. They no longer feared death. They no longer clung to material things. They lived with a calm detachment, knowing that this life was temporary, that the soul's journey was vast, that nothing was truly lost. He gave techniques for achieving this in several readings. Some people tried them, some succeeded. Most couldn't handle what they saw. Your soul doesn't go where you think, and maybe that's the point.